It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This museum is about as complete as any in the world. Many of the displays include the various smallest and the earliest development of aviation to the recent launch of the space shuttle. It's incredible.
Well, I'm so thrilled to meet you and have the opportunity to hear more about your work. So as you may know, over 400,000 people contributed to Project Apollo. It was a huge effort, massive national mobilization, and also people around the world were contributing as well. And we often focus on the stories of walking on the moon, but there's so many wonderful stories to tell and people that contributed to making Project Apollo a reality. And it wouldn't have been possible without the effort of so many people working together and being so dedicated and making sure that the program was accomplished and accomplished well. So where were you on October 4th, 1957?
I was in the United States Air Force, just about to take a position with North American Aviation during that period back in the early 60s. And interestingly enough, my first position with North American was with their avionics division, which a good percentage of the development of very important electronic components were developed for the Apollo program. We were the pioneers in the design and development of integrated circuits, which are commonplace, where we've taken a huge bay of computer systems and reduced it down to a thumbnail. But the integrated circuits allowed us to increase the capacity of our spacecraft, allowed us to increase the capacity of our rocket fuels and our environmental control systems to launch the various spacecraft into orbit or to the moon.
So as we were talking about in 1957, after the launch of Sputnik, there was this concern within the United States that the Soviet Union was ahead technologically and militarily as well. And in the spring of 1961, the Soviet Union beat the United States into space with the first human spaceflight, Yuri Gagarin's flight in April. President Kennedy in the United States was quite concerned about that.
Looking at it in terms of how we've gone from the early 60s until the moon launching, in that very short period of time, we accomplished miracles because the great percentage of what was developed for this program did not exist. We're talking about materials, we're talking about technologies, making reference to what we experience in space. What is out there that we don't know about that may harm our astronauts? If you're aware, the original program was to launch several astronauts to the moon and to have the spacecraft land on the moon. And hopefully, in the meantime, we're on the Earth trying to figure out how to bring them back. That didn't work very well, and of course it was scrubbed, but we finally succumbed to the recommendations of folks from MIT who suggested we need to seriously think about orchestrating a technology rendezvous here, which eventually became the Lunar Excursion Module.
We didn't know how to rendezvous and dock in space, or the effects of long duration space flight. So all of that had to be worked out and developed in a very, very short time frame.
When we finally see the Apollo launched, and in orbit, and it's on its way to the moon. We're going to be confronted with obstacles that we don't anticipate, nor how do we avoid them, such as space granules, which are called meteorites, very small, which is commonly referred to as shooting stars. Well, all of the people that come on board to suggest fear not, we called on the astronomers, and the astronomer says shooting stars only occur once a year, and that's during the preceding season in August. The meteorites or the shooting stars are between 50 and 100 miles apart, so the probability of having one of those injure or cause damage to the spacecraft are nil and none. So those are a number of areas that, all of a sudden we're going to space and we're not sure what's out there. And
what's interesting also about so many of the people that contributed to Project Apollo is they were quite young at the time. So
yeah.
I think the average age of mission control was between 26 and 27 years old, quite young.
Yes.
And I imagine you and your colleagues were also relatively young when you were working Apollo.
But it's amazing, and I'm sure you're well aware, how did we find all these brilliant people? It's incredible what they've done. And they all sat around a room 24/7 trying to figure something out. It's amazing it all worked out.
Especially because each one of these small details you have to solve, but it's part of this larger system. And so there's a push and a pull, and if you add weight, then it changes things for the development of the launch system. And so there's it was a very a delicate balance, it seems.
The weight and balance was obviously an issue, issued to the extent where during the construction of the Saturn V system, the folks who were working on the line that were installing systems and subsystems, if indeed they should drop a very small portion of weld anywhere in that area, it would have an adverse effect on the trajectory. It's incredible. That's how close the tolerances were. And how did they reduce the weight? Because weight was extremely important if we were to increase the payload of the spacecraft and the astronauts. We went to what is commonly referred to as a honeycomb technology that was developed by North America for the XB-70 program back in the middle 50s. But a lot of that technology found its way into the spacecraft. And then all of what we learned on the Apollo and the Space Shuttle program has found its way into state-of-the-art aviation today.
I guess one of the very sort of significant framings of Project Apollo, or sort of results of Project Apollo, was this sense that the whole world participated in the program. And I think it's really captured well by Mike Collins, who talks about traveling the world after their flight. So after the first lunar landing mission, the Apollo 11 crew traveled the world. And they went to over 20 countries in a few months. And he said that when they were traveling, they expected to hear, you did it, or you Americans did it, you went to the moon. And what he heard and said was, we did it. And there was this sense that it was something that all of humanity participated in. And then a lot of the people who contributed to the program either came from other countries or have connections to other countries like you do.
My father came to this country before the First World War. He was an officer in the Serbian army, came from the village of Okučana, fought in the Balkan Wars. He settled in the village of Midland, Pennsylvania, which is a few miles from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My mother came from Glina, from the Todorović family. And She settled later in a small coal mining town in Vincentdale, Pennsylvania. So we've been extremely fortunate in not losing our identity as Serbs, but more importantly, as a youngster, my father always reminded me how fortunate I was to have been born in the United States, and continually emphasized the importance of my being an American, but more importantly, always reminded me, Davide, ti si ovdje rođen kao Amerikanac, nemoj da zaboraviš odakle ste. And he was very strict in seeing to it that I spoke the language, and more importantly, that I, at the time, had an opportunity to learn to read Cyrillicu. So we didn't lose sight of the importance of what we represented as an American Serbian family, and more importantly, in our small community. I continued my education at several colleges in California, where I received a degree in business administration. And I went on to, and this is when I relocated to California, and I was working for North American Aviation at the time. As when I left the United States Air Force, I took a position with a company. More importantly, during one point in time, the company was looking to become more familiar with the use of computer-aided design systems, and they decided to send me back to college to learn a little bit about computer-aided design technology. So I was fortunate enough to have received further degree education at the University of Southern California in what they call business and industrial sciences. That today is commonly referred to as information technology. So we were just introducing the computer into the world of the designing of aircraft and spacecraft at the time. I had moved from our electronics division to our space division during that period, where I met with Slavoljub, Vujić, and Milojko, and I became part of the program management operation. During the initial phases of the design development of the Apollo spacecraft in conjunction with NASA's requirements, I was in the area that was primarily responsible for reviewing all of the technical data in various phases called critical and preliminary and critical design review. I was fortunate enough to have come together with a number of our Serbian colleagues on the program, to include those that we commonly refer to as the Serbo 7. Milojko Vucilic was the chief engineer and a brilliant gentleman and a scholar. He was NASA's equivalent of the Apollo Space Launch Director for North American Aviation, and we were the original contractor on the project. We later became North American Rockwell, when Rockwell teamed with North American Aviation. Milojko Vucilic was heavily involved in the program from the onset. Mike came to North American Aviation from the Bendix Aviation, also worked when he first migrated to the United States. He's with Cessna Aviation, where he actually developed several systems for Cessna. But more importantly, his time to come to the space program was incredible, because he had a brilliant mind and was very instrumental in the success of the project. Other members of the team include a gentleman by the name Miloš Obatović. He's a mechanical engineer. He also worked on the docking systems that were designed specifically for the Apollo in the Lunar Excursion Module docking. Another key individual on the project was a gentleman by the name of Vujić. Danilo was also instrumental in the design of the emergency escape system on the Apollo spacecraft. If you recall, we lost 3 astronauts as a result of a fire, and it was unfortunate, but it was something that we anticipated because of the total oxygen environment in the space capsule. Slavoj Vujić was electronics engineer, heavily involved in coordinating all the electronic systems and development. Paul Vujić was also in logistics. He worked, I think, in the logistics and other parts of the project. Interestingly enough, Paul Vujić and I met many years earlier when he was in the United States Air Force, and I met him then. And then, interestingly enough, we coincidentally met on the Apollo program. And then there was Paul Galovich. He was also a mechanical engineer, and that wrapped up a good percentage of our original Serbo 7 group. We had established a camaraderie. We met frequently in restaurants and where we came together as fellow Serbs for dinner or for lunch, and we continued our Serbian relationship up until the last of the Apollo missions were completed. I, at that time, prior to the final project of the Apollo missions, I was scheduled to move to the space shuttle program, but because of my Air Force background, I was moved to the aviation division in the design and development of state-of-the-art aircraft for the military. So I went to work for the gentleman who was actually designing the Apollo spacecraft, the service module, the command module. His name was Harrison Storms. Mr. Storms was a brilliant aerodynamicist, and he was also the protege of Theodore von Karman, who was considered one of the foremost at jet propulsion laboratories. Harrison Storms was overwhelmed to have Milojko Vujić on the Apollo team. As a matter of fact, we used to call him affectionately Stormy. When Stormy became irritated because programs were not materializing as he hoped they would, he would start swearing in Serbian because he learned it from Mike Vujić. So we had made our mark within the highest levels of our organization on the Apollo program.
When the Apollo 11 crew, after they splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, successfully finishing their mission, President Nixon asked them to serve as his representatives on a world tour. And they visited every continent, and they chose to visit Belgrade, which would be the only stop within Eastern Europe. And they were in Belgrade by mid-October of 1969, and they had a short visit there. They were very warmly received. One of the people who was part of the support staff mentioned that it was the highlight of the tour so far, that stop in Belgrade. Yeah. They had a meal with Tito and his wife, Jovanka, as well as some other people. And Neil Armstrong gave a toast, and in his toast, he referenced you and your colleagues, and talked about the contribution of Serbian Americans to the space program.
We met with astronauts on a frequent basis, and fortunately, I befriended two of those gentlemen, and we became very close. One was Pete Conrad, probably one of the funniest guys in the universe, and Gordon Cooper. Grew up on an Indian reservation and became an astronaut. Think about that. But Gordon Cooper was very, he and I were very close, and I enjoyed telling the story. I was attending the Paris Air Show, and by chance I ran into Gordon Cooper at the hotel where I was staying. So we were enjoying a dinner, and I asked him the question. I said, Gordon, what are you doing since you retired from NASA? And he said, well, he said, interestingly enough, I received some funds to develop technologies that were designed in theory years ago by scientists who have done an outstanding job in providing state-of-the-art systems to the world. And so I've taken an opportunity to select several of those concepts, designs and theories, and put them into reality. And he says to me, David, you wouldn't know who this gentleman is. I said, well, try me. He said, his name is Nikola Tesla. I said, come on, Gordon. You know, Mike and I and the whole crew are Serbs. He said, oh yeah, I forgot that part. So it was an interesting exchange, but it was such a delight to be in the company of these gentlemen and these heroes. They committed themselves to the unknown, and they made us all proud. And it was especially important for those of us that worked the program, that we had access to them. And over the years, they've never forgotten us. They've always come back to us. We oftentimes make reference to the fact that we worked 24/7. We slept on our conference tables or in our cars because we couldn't lose any time. We had what we commonly refer to as brain momentum, and we didn't want to lose it at any given time. So, but on the other hand, the pleasantries were overwhelming. For every minute success, there was a celebration. The Apollo crew was a very serious crew, guys. Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins weren't necessarily the guys that you want to go out drinking with, because they didn't do that. Buzz Aldrin did some of that, but the guys outside of that particular mission, as I mentioned, like Gordon Cooper and what have you, those are the really fun guys. I had the great pleasure of spending time with Charlie Duke also, and Gus Grissom and that crew. We were all fraternity members, and it was, as you can well imagine, terribly saddening when we lost that crew. Gus was also a fun guy. He was very much a disciplinarian, as were all the astronauts, but Gus in particular recognized the value of a no-nonsense approach to a critical environment, and he made certain that we were all on the same page, and it worked well because looking at it in perspective, we all communicated well under the most difficult of circumstances. And when Apollo 13 made reference to Houston, we have a problem, Mike was the first person they called because they were all aware that he was very much involved in the various equations that made reference to the environmental control systems. Pretty much talked the astronauts down, making them aware, find a piece of cardboard there and, and salvage as much oxygen as you possibly can upon reentry. And he did an outstanding job. And as a result, he was awarded the Medal of Freedom from President Nixon. And of course, we're all proud of Mike for that accomplishment. The other one was the emergency escape hatch on the spacecraft. As you can well appreciate, the original hatch it took some 90 seconds to open that thing. It was redesigned by one of our engineers by the name of Danilo
And this is the
Vujić.
command module hatch.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we boil it down to 3 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And we're extremely proud of the contributions of the American Serbian community, and especially the Apollo, what we call the Serbo 7 space launch team. We're currently in the esteemed edifice of the National Press Club. It is composed of journalists, media, press from all over the world. Not only did I join the National Press Club because I became actively involved in a number of their activities. I have organized press conferences and for various executive from the Serbian government, to include the Prime Minister. Both my wife Ginger and I are always available to see to it that the message of the Serbian issue is conveyed in perspective, especially here in this edifice, in this organization that is considered the epitome of the media organizations in the world. The American dream is the Serbian dream. The personality and the attitude of the Serbian and the Serbian American people is incredible, because we have certainly recognized the value added, first of all, of achieving certain success. Secondly, not embarrassing a family, and more importantly, not to embarrass our heritage. With all that in perspective, we want to see to it that whatever we might achieve would be recognized as an attempt to see our community proud of our accomplishments. I was honored to have worked in this building, both in the House and the Senate side. While in the House side, I was a member of the professional staff for defense appropriation, military construction. Been up here not only as a member of a congressional staff, but over the years, when I left the government, I became a government affairs executive for a number of large aerospace firms, as well as a lobbyist for a number of special interest organizations. My wife also worked here on Capitol Hill. She been here for over 30 years and later became one of the directors of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Ginger worked for members of Congress in the Senate. She worked on the House side. But more importantly, Ginger was one of very few women back in the 60s that was the chief of staff to a member of Congress or to a senator. Ginger also was a member of several very important staffs for the committee. She and colleagues and myself organized a company, a special interest group known as We Will Survive Cancer. That organization is designed specifically to provide support to families with cancer, because many of these families cannot afford the unfortunate circumstances of dealing with someone with cancer in their home. So we provide support to the children, we provide transportation to those with cancer, we assist in purchasing medications, whatever have you. We established a rather unique camaraderie, but more importantly, we all had our specific areas of responsibility. And we were very proud and honored to have been part of that project. It's something that comes once in a lifetime. And speaking on behalf of my departed colleagues today, it was an overwhelming joy and an honor to be in their company. And that it was such an honor for us to have been recognized in playing a role in the success of this success of this project. And I hope that what we've established here would make our colleagues and our friends and our relatives in Serbia proud.
you.